Hello, everyone. My name is Miriam Wagner. I'm the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute. Thank you very much for joining us again at this webinar series, which is jointly run by the Wolf Institute and by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. We have other partners as well, the CSIC IMF, the University of Munich, the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln, Leicester Medieval Research Center, and Ghent University. This is now actually the third year that we're running these joint webinars, and it's really, really nice to be back. Very nice to have you back in the audiences. Many of you are familiar with these webinars, but those who aren't, I'll just very quickly introduce the two main host institutions. The Wolf Institute is a research institute in Cambridge, which focuses on religion and society. And we combine our research with teaching, with public education, and with policy work. Please have a look at our website and our YouTube channel to learn more about our work, and also to see the other videos of our past 2 seasons of this very, very exciting webinar series. Now I'm putting on the other hat, the society hat. The Society for the Medieval Mediterranean was founded in 1997, and it is dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th century. This is usually the moment when I introduce the journal of the society. Unfortunately, I'm doing this from home. Unusually, I don't have the copies with me. They are in my office. But if you have a look online, Almazak is our journal. The copy of Almazak comes as part of the subscription of the membership of the society. So if you are not a member, do consider joining the society. You can find out how to do that on the webpage. So without further ado, our topic of the day is mobility, belonging, and community in the Mediterranean city, Barcelona, Venice, and Constantinople, 1400 to 1550. And our chair today will be Professor Rosaire Salicru, who's a very, very long-term SMM collaborator. We're very, very fond of working with Rosaire, and we're very, very curious of the webinar that she's organized today. So she will in turn introduce the speakers. The panelists will all present and will have a short discussion among themselves where you can prepare questions for the Q&A if you want. You can type these questions, please, into the Q&A portal on the bottom of your screens, because it's much easier for the chair to handle those questions that way rather than putting them in the chat. We will stop the live streaming and the filming at 6 o'clock sharp. But you are then invited to stay behind in the webinar. We usually continue a little bit more of an informal chat after that time. So please, sign off at 6 or join us for a bit longer as you wish. And now I'm handing over to the chair. Rosaire, over to you.
Thanks, Miriam. Good evening, everyone, and welcome again to this first session of the third series of the webinar Medieval Mediterranean, Local and Global Perspectives. The aim of this session is to offer a parallel analysis on the processes of community building, social advancement, and agency in the late medieval Mediterranean. It will focus on 3 cities that will take us, following a chronological order in the presentations, from one shore of the Mediterranean to the other. The urban context of Barcelona, Venice, and Constantinople will allow us to delve into the different ways that individuals and groups strove to improve their position within the fabric of the late medieval, early modern city. Consequently, the papers in this session will consider issues such as the importance of sociability in the creation of belonging, the role of profession in the establishment of urban hierarchies, and the agency of foreign communities in the shaping of urban life. Our 3 speakers today, the 3 of them holding a PhD in History and Civilization from the European University Institute of Florence, are Carolina Oberto-Suazo, Osden Mercant, and Lisa de la Valle. Carolina, with a presentation entitled Between Place and Space, Neighbors, Witnesses, and Citizens in 15th Century Barcelona. Carolina is a medievalist specializing on urban history with a focus on late medieval Catalonia. She defended a thesis at the European University Institute on citizenship in 15th century Barcelona in 1215. She has been a postdoctoral visiting researcher at the Laboratoire de Médiévistique Occidentale of Paris in 2017, as well as a postdoctoral fellow at the École des Hautes Études Hispaniques et Ibériques, Casa de Velázquez, Madrid, in 2020-2021. She recently published an article on the ritualization of citizenship in medieval Barcelona in urban history, and will soon join the Department of American and Medieval History and Historiographical Sciences at the Universidad Complutense of Madrid as a Marie Curie Co-Fund Fellow. She is currently preparing a monograph for Brepols entitled The Making of Citizens in 15th Century Barcelona, Identification, Belonging, and Sociabilities in a Mediterranean City. Özden from Hacettepe University, Ankara, Turkey, will present a paper on Friends of the Sultan, Florentines in Ottoman Constantinople in the late 15th century. Her academic research mainly focuses on late medieval and early modern Mediterranean history. In her dissertation, she examined the diplomatic, political, cultural, and economic relations of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, Genoa, and Venice with the Ottoman Empire during the 16th century in light of the documents in the Italian archives. Her current research project focuses on the Ottoman migrants in Tuscan ports in the late 16th and 17th centuries, placing a particular emphasis on their motives or reasons for migrating and the mediating role they played between Tuscany and the Ottoman Empire. In addition, she has also made research and published on European communities and émigrés in Turkey, on practices of coexistence and constructions of the other in the early modern period. Last, but of course not least, our third speaker, Lisa, will talk about legal professionals in late medieval Venice. Lisa completed her PhD at the European University Institute in 2017, and her research focuses on family networks in 17th century Venice and England. In 2018, she was a fellow at the Fondazione Cini, Venice. She is currently a research assistant on the project Flighter Paper, Art, Craft, and the earliest mass-produced wallpaper in the West. She published an article in Gender and History in 2015, and she is currently preparing a monograph for publication with Routledge entitled Family Hierarchies, Marriage and Inheritance Practices in early modern Venice. So the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, José, for this presentation. Can you all hear me well? Yes. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Can you all hear me well? Yes. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, it should be working. Yes, so as I was saying, thank you, José. Thank you, Miriam and Antonella, for this opportunity from the Wolf Institute and the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. And last but not least, thank you, Lisa and Özden, for agreeing to putting up together this session today. So without further ado, let me start this discussion on the connections between neighborhood witnessing and belonging in the late medieval city with a quotation. Recourse must be had to the neighborhood, and his verdict shall be conclusive. wrote the English jurist Glanville around 1189 when discussing the intricacies of jury trial in his Tractatus de legibus et consuetudinibus Regni Angliae. Later on, in the last third of the 13th century, the jurist Guillaume Durand provided a renowned theorizing of the figure of the witness in his Speculum Judiciale, where he stated that, and I quote, "We are presumed to know the deeds of our neighbors." So I guess what I'm trying to point here with these two somehow disparate quotations is that a long legal European tradition, having portrayed the figure of the neighbor as a trusted and privileged source of information, might have assisted the municipal authorities of the city of Barcelona, major political and economic center of Catalonia in the Crown of Aragon, when in the last third of the 14th century, they decided to establish a new procedure of citizenship acquisition. This new procedure was based on the combination of citizenship oaths and that were faithfully recorded and citizenship investigations, where sworn witnesses were summoned to describe the good habits as citizens of those requesting a citizenship charter and the trading privileges it implied. Now, the material conserved at this regard, the so-called Informacions de la Ciutadania, show that more than 60% of the candidates submitted to an investigation of citizenship between 1395 and 1457, so more than 60% of those candidates were allowed to present at least one neighbor as their citizenship witnesses, which were an average of 4 or 5. With such a procedure, the city of Barcelona probably aimed at supervising closely the making of the urban community in intricate times where the commercial projection of the city coexisted with inner tensions marked by epidemics, wheat scarcity, growing inequalities, political polarization. Yet what it's also important to note here is that this new procedure contributed to ritualized citizenship, and in so doing, it transformed the Barcelonese citizen, priorly mostly a privileged figure, that is, an inhabitant of the city with a charter that granted privileges. The citizen became now an engaged urban agent, shaped in terms of practices and performances. So this paper now uses this material, these Informacions de la Ciutadania, to dig deep into the social cultural dimension of citizenship by examining the ways in which neighbors as citizenship witnesses contributed to this transformation of the citizen. And in so doing, it aims at discussing the meanings of neighborhood and neighborliness in 15th century Barcelona. So neighborhood dynamics in pre-modern cities have often been described in terms of conflict, for we have better grasped them through trials and the depiction of daily quarrels that they provide. The Informacions, in contrast, allows to picture a more positive side of the story. It allows us to see positive practices of neighborliness. For these interrogations were often the opportunity for neighbors to depict each other as citizens and as good citizens. In so doing, neighbor witnesses picture the neighborhood as a social and civic network that was, however, very much framed in spatial terms with precise coordinates. Candidates were often identified by their neighbors as individuals living in the space of the neighborhood, in the veïnat, rather than as neighbors, as veïns. That is a term we find rarely. The language of neighborhood and neighbors was linked indeed to the physicality of the shared space, which was often minimized to the single street. Good citizens were described by neighbors as individuals living in their immediate surroundings. In front of them, you have here some examples, under a neighboring arch, somewhere in the same street, or most significantly, on the other side of their own wall. That's this paret mitgera d'ami. So as a practice of neighborliness, neighbor witnesses used their statements somehow to create feelings of nearness around candidates. And in so doing, witnesses directly relate the experiences of their neighbors in the urban space with conceptions and requirements of citizenship, which both formally and informally were related to the fact of having a stable residence in the city, a stable life in the city. Yet what interests me here also is how witnesses found other strategies to create physical nearness that went beyond, or even in some cases ignored, displacement through precise coordinates or urbanistic landmarks. For it was only within a context of close coexistence that witnesses could have an insight into the daily life of candidates and their families, and they proved so by recalling in their statements that, for example, they had heard their children in the street or they had seen their wives spinning at their doorsteps. But let me recall yet another example of this, for example, the case of Miquela, wife of Yemcoy, peasant and citizen of Barcelona. In 1395, she participated as a witness in the citizenship report of the peasant Bernat Montmany. While her own address is not specified in the report, so we are not sure if she's actually a neighbor of the candidate, she remembers seeing him, and she provides very local and detailed information. She can say that she saw him acquiring a house in Barcelona where, I quote her, she sees him all day eating and sleeping with his wife, end of the quote. So unfortunately, I do not have the time here to provide you with more examples of these tales of nearness that I've told them. But I guess what I would like to suggest here with these other examples you can find in the slide is that some of these depositions have a sort of, or give us an idea of a sort of intensity of neighborliness or intensity of nearness that was clearly based on daily observation, but at the same time tends to blur the meanings of the neighborhood by widening the physical scope of these neighborhood relationships, because they could include indeed people like Miquela, who was probably a neighbor, but yet we are not sure, but also old neighbors, and here we have some other examples, old neighbors who are not neighbors anymore, but are willing to testify positively about the citizenship of these candidates, and also as well individuals who just came to the city. So we could say that they still didn't have the time to really integrate these neighborhood networks, but still they've manifested an effort for it, and they are accepted as such. And in this case, let me recall in 1455, the silversmith Joan Bargés, who positively portrays Guillem Miró, a merchant arrived a month ago from the surroundings of Barcelona, and he's portrayed as a citizen because they've seen him really moving all his belongings day after day, boxes, beds, etc., to this new house he has rented in the street Groñ in Barcelona. So I'm already going towards some concluding thoughts. This has only been a very fast review on the possibilities of the Informacions to bring forward the language of neighborhood and neighborliness as a language of nearness in the late medieval city. While this analysis coincides with previous scholarship having highlighted the plasticity and ambiguity of the late medieval neighborhood, what I want to do with this paper is to focus, to stress its strength as an analytical tool. Because while Barcelona as a place like any other medieval city was conceived as an administrative and a military space through districts, and we had 4 districts in late medieval Barcelona, as you can see in the slide. It was also conceived as a religious space, of course, through its parishes, and we had 7. The neighborhood, as the smallest analytical scale, unveils, despite of its ambiguity, the power of the city as a social space whose pillars lied on trust and the expectations urban dwellers had towards the good behavior of their fellow neighbors. In this view, neighbors were far from being confused about the scope of their neighborly space. The language they used in the depositions, more than other kinds of witnesses, was based on detail and precision, both in terms of space, as we have seen, and time. They might not always remember the amounts of years one had been living in the city, but as collective memory of their urban space, they are able to use other kinds of references. They recorded deaths, such as Gabriel Salvador's father or Bernat Llorera's aunt, and remember accurately, as we've seen in many trials, but also here sometimes, episodes of violence and disruption. It is indeed the repetition of violent events portrayed with vivid detail in a report from 1457 what pushed a group of neighbors to testify against Michela Reyer, the wife of a glazier, whose madly behavior and constant insults was disturbing the reputation of their neighborhood. In the words of Isabel, wife to a squire, because of Michela, the whole neighborhood is dishonored and insulted by her venomous tongue. A gran culpa de la dita Michela, lo veïnat és deshonrat e vituperat per la sua mala lengua. In an exercise of neighborliness to each other, neighbors reunited, complained, and managed to have her exposed, actually, from their common shared space in the city. Now, I'm referring now to something that is actually not a citizenship report and is a document that has been probably misplaced within the Informaciones where I found it. But it remains somehow a perfect example of the power of the neighborhood as this united community, this veïnat that comes so often in the sources, in defining what was admittable and what was unacceptable in civic life. Witnesses' depositions in the Informaciones expose the intangibility of the neighborhood, while showing its capacity to space, to distribute individuals, to then demonstrate and show their interactions. So the power of the neighborhood as a place lies, therefore, in its capacity to portray citizens as social beings. If, as the thinker and psychologist Pierre Janet put it, narration created humanity, I strongly believe that neighbors' stories as witnesses created trusted citizens in 15th century Barcelona, evincing with no doubt the deep connection between neighborhood and belonging in the late medieval city. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Carolina, for this excellent paper. And we move now quickly to Osden and to Florentines in Constantinople.
Can you hear me? I think so, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Rosé. Thank you for the introduction. And I would like to thank Wolf Institute for this webinar. In my presentation, I'll take you to Ottoman Constantinople. I'm going to talk about the Florentine merchant community in the late 15th century. Let me share my screen for the PowerPoint. Okay. Yeah, it should be fine now, I guess. Yeah. In 1588, Jacopo Mormorai, a Florentine commission agent in the woolen cloth trade, penned a lengthy proposal to the new Grand Duke Ferdinando I de' Medici on the importance of restoring commercial relations with the Ottoman court for the Grand Duchy. Mormorai's proposal is particularly important for its elaborate description of historical friendship between Florence and the Ottoman Empire, dating back to the late 15th century. According to him, a Florentine bailo had been sent to Constantinople to reside permanently as early as 1470s. There existed reciprocal security and privileges for the merchants of both states. Ottoman merchants formerly traded in Florence, just as Florentine merchants did in Constantinople. Mormorai stated that this situation had continued for 60 years, during which the Florentines were able to dominate the Ottoman market, taking advantage of the constant wars between the Venetians and the Ottomans. The Florentine agent also discovered in some historical records that there had been 22 mercantile firms in Pera, which was a district close to Constantinople, belonging to Florentine nobles at that time. The Florentines were in fact so satisfied with the conditions in the Ottoman Empire that more and more came to settle there, and some, such as Galliani, Verrazzani, and Doni, married local women and soon became parrots. Here, parrots refer to, well, it is coming from the district Pera. It refers to the permanent settlers of Pera. And basically, if they became parrots, this means that they became the subjects of the Sultan. Mormorai put specific emphasis on the substantial volume of trade on the substantial volume of trade the Florentine merchants conducted, noting that they had returned to Florence with thousands of ducats each year. Thus, he wrote, Florence's present prosperity had its origins 50 years ago in the commerce with Constantinople. According to him, this situation began to change after 1537, when the Venetians made peace with the Ottomans and secured trade privileges in the Ottoman Empire. Overall, this report is a valuable source demonstrating us the emergence of a Florentine merchant community in Ottoman Constantinople in the late 15th century. Unlike the Genoese and Venetians, who had presence in the Eastern Mediterranean since the Byzantine times and who had already established contacts with the Ottomans far before the conquest of Constantinople, the turning point for Florentines and Florentine trade in the Eastern Mediterranean came after the conquest of Constantinople. Mehmet II granted extensive trading privileges. Well, Pera is here, the district just across the main city, Constantinople. So basically, European settlers, ambassadors, diplomats, merchants stayed in this district. Yes, Sultan Mehmet II granted extensive trading privileges to the Florentine merchants and permanent representation in Pera, which enabled them to exert considerable influence in the Ottoman market at the expense of the Genoese and the Venetians. One of the factors that played a role in Florentine presence in Constantinople during this period was the pragmatism and inclusivism maintained by the Ottoman state during the post-conquest period. These enabled the incorporation of the former Byzantine inhabitants and Italian merchants into the social and political fabric of the new imperial capital through covenants, providing them autonomy in the practice of their faith and in organizing their internal affairs in return for their loyalty to the state and payment of the tax. This also paralleled Mehmet II's imperial vision, as he wanted to create a world empire governed from Constantinople. He constructed a cosmopolitan capital city by repopulating and rebuilding it with communities of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. Among these, there were also the Florentines. In regulating his relations with the Florentines, or in general terms, with Italians in Istanbul, Mehmet II followed practices more or less similar to those of the Byzantines, combining these with Islamic traditions. Italian merchant communities were allowed to conduct their trade activities within the framework of ahitnames, which were unilateral grants of privileges and protection to foreign merchants. Here I gave the example of the ahitname granted by Sultan Mehmet II to the Genoese of Pera. This is actually from later period, from 1613, because we don't have any ahitname remain from the Florentine period, Florentine Ottoman contacts. So in order to give you an idea about what kind of a document ahitname is, here, this is one of the examples. So in this respect, ahitnames could be considered as having a close affinity to the Byzantine chrysobulls. Both were granted to a friendly or subordinate party. Moreover, the classification of foreign merchants as temporary merchants or permanent settlers, referred to in the context of Islamic law as mustemin and zimmi, had similarities to the Byzantine practice, which differentiated temporary merchants who could stay up to 10 years from habitores burgenses who were permanent settlers. To give a little bit detail on that, in Islamic law, there were two types of non-Muslims: zimmi, who were tributary subjects, and mustemin. These were temporary inhabitants residing in Islamic territories for commercial and diplomatic purposes. So the status of zimmi was acquired in return for the payment of poll tax and land tax. This was what had been done in the case of the Genoese of Pera. And those asking for protection obtained the status of mustemin. They were allowed to stay for a limited period of time without paying poll tax or land tax, and they could have a representative called a bailo or consul who would advocate for the interests of the merchants and deal with the Ottoman authorities. The main preconditions for an ahitname were friendship and sincerity. So as long as these were assured, the European merchant communities were able to obtain privileges from the Sublime Porte, which was the first step to staying and trading in the Ottoman lands. The ahitname was at the same time a legal document that determined the status, rights, and obligations of foreigners in the Ottoman Empire. While how it actually worked in practice is a matter open to question, this official document provided the legal framework for not only the commercial activities, but also the social life of foreign merchants in the Ottoman domains. In the case of Florentines, we see that while they remained citizens of their respective states and stay in the Ottoman lands on temporary basis as Müstemin. Mehmet II granted privileges allowing all Florentines to come and trade in the Ottoman domains without paying customs duties. They could have their own dwellings and a church in which to freely exercise their religion. From Florentine merchant and agent Benedetto Dei's account, he was also in Constantinople for a long period of time, and he was very close to Sultan Mehmet II. And later on, he wrote La Cronica, and the part related to Constantinople and his experience about Ottoman people is quite interesting. He provided very interesting details, and we can get a lot of information about the activities of Florentine community in Constantinople at the time in his chronicle. So looking at this account, it can be deduced that the first formal ahitname was granted to the Florentine community in 1461. Considering as well the fact that the first permanent representative of the Florentine community in Istanbul, Mainardo degli Ubaldini, was appointed more or less in the same year, it seems reasonable to assume that in return for their support against the Venetians in the Peloponnesian campaign, Mehmet II granted privileges, allowing the Florentine merchants to trade in the Ottoman lands. So in this way, the Sultan also secured the alliance of the Florentines as his greatest and best friends, recorded by Benedetto Dei like that, in case of a possible Holy League directed against the Ottomans under Papal and Venetian leadership. Unfortunately, the official document containing the capitulations granted by Mehmet II is not available to us. The earliest copy available to us is the one dated from 1500, and it was granted in Edirne by Sultan Beyazıt II as a renewal of the privileges previously granted to the Florentine community by his father, Mehmet II. So in general terms, these privileges include guarantees of freedom of trade and travel in the Ottoman domains, including the Black Sea, security for the persons and properties of Florentine merchants, and customs duty rates similar to those paid by the Venetians. Florentine merchants buying silk in Bursa, at the time Bursa was an important center for both raw silk and silk textiles. So Florentine merchants buying silk in Bursa would not be double taxed. The Ottoman administration would guarantee the security of the Florentine merchants' property at sea and on overland trade routes against depredations by the Venetians, Genoese, and others. And as for civil and criminal matters arising among the Florentines, the baillo or emino would be responsible for the jurisdiction, and the Florentines free to choose their own witnesses in legal cases. However, in the case of conflicts with other non-Muslims or Ottoman subjects, an Ottoman Kadı, judge, would be the main authority. So the close collaboration and alliance between the Florentine community and Sultan Mehmet II continued full steam ahead during the Ottoman-Venetian War from 1463 to 1479. Consul Mainardo Ubaldini and Florentine merchants Jacopo Tedaldi, Nicola Ardielli, Carlo Martelli actively supported Mehmet II's decision to declare war on Venice, sharing with him secret letters of the Venetians concerning a possible attack against the Ottomans. Moreover, in 1466, Benedetto Dei obtained in Chios a letter belonging to the Venetians, which he immediately sent to the Florentine consul in Pera, who presented this letter to the Sultan. And in the letter, the writer spoke of the alliance of the Venetians with other Italian rulers and the Pope against the Ottoman Sultan, bragging that Venetian priests would soon be celebrating Mass in Santa Sofia. This news was enough to inflame the Sultan's anger against the Venetians. Besides providing intelligence on the Venetians' moves, the Florentines advised the Sultan concerning the construction of fortifications and artillery installations along the Dardanelles to defend against the Venetian attacks. They also accompanied the Ottoman army in its campaigns. For instance, Benedetto Bey himself participated in Mehmet II's campaign against the Venetians in Argos and Mistras in Peloponnese and in Albania. The Florentines even organized public feasts in Pera, this area again, and this is a map from a later period by Buondelmonti, attributed to Buondelmonti. Yes, and they even organized public feasts in Pera to celebrate the Sultan's victories. Similarly, in 1470, when the Ottomans occupied Negroponte, a significant commercial and military Venetian outpost in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Florentines chose not to respond to the Sultan's actions. Neither Pope Paul II's exhortations to the Florentines for a united expedition against the Ottomans, nor the Venetians' appeal to their brothers and dearest friends to act together against the common enemy had any effect on the Florentines. Their neutral stance even led to rumors that they provided financial and logistical support to the Ottoman fleet during the conquest of Negroponte, to the detriment of their commercial rival, Venice. In conclusion, it can be argued that the Sultan's conflict with the Venetians played into the hands of the Florentines in the Ottoman Empire in a significant way. As a consequence of the Ottoman-Venetian wars, many Venetians residing in the Ottoman lands were imprisoned, their commodities and houses were seized. The resultant commercial lacuna was quickly filled by the Florentines, who soon expanded their interests in the Ottoman market. There was great demand for woolen cloth in the Ottoman Empire, especially for the growing army, Janissaries. So Florentines met this demand with their domestically produced garbo cloth and in fact almost monopolized the trade of woolen cloth in the Ottoman market. Providing the Ottoman army with woolen cloth thus brought a remarkable upsurge to the woolen cloth industry in Florence. In return, the main commodity they bought in the Ottoman market was Persian raw silk, which was in demand for the developing silk industry. Despite certain periods of stagnation and crisis in Florentine trade in the Ottoman market due to the plague, the prospects of profitable trade continued to attract Florentine merchants to that market. Moreover, through the agency of some Florentine merchants, Mehmet II established contacts with the Italian courts, closely followed the developments in European states, and even patronized Renaissance art. They not only played an important role, the Florentine merchants in Constantinople not only played an important role as intermediaries in diplomatic relations with the West, but also made possible various sorts of exchange in ideas, information, know-how, and goods, promoting cross-cultural interaction and the formation of political alliances between the Ottoman Empire and Renaissance Italy. Thus, there were various dynamics and political and economic interests that connected the Florentines with the Ottomans during this period. And all these played an important role in the formation of a Florentine community in Constantinople. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Özden, for this interesting presentation. And now we move and I give the floor to Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, I would like to echo the sentiments of Carolina and Özden and thank Rosé and the Wolf Institute for all their efforts in helping us to do this presentation. So, to begin, this paper will examine the social professional status of the legal profession in Venice from the 14th century until the reform of the legal profession in 1537 with the Correzioni Gritti. The starting point for this paper has its roots in the 17th century, when lawyers, as part of a broader group of civil professionals, experienced a rise in status by virtue of their profession, not their citizenship status or residence in the city. From 1607 onwards, the Stati delle Anime parish censuses for the city included the following instruction. For citizens include lawyers, doctors, notaries, and others that practice civil professions. Civil professionals, regardless of their term of residence in the city, were to be listed in the citizen category This did not afford these individuals a formal recognition of status in the city, but it recognized that those who practiced genteel or civil professions were to be given special consideration. For context, the Venetian citizenry were divided into two categories. The relative newcomers to the city could apply to become cittadini di intus and later intus extra. These were categories that provided mercantile privileges in Venice. On the other side, there were cittadini originari, native Venetians, who held the most prestigious profession and positions in the city. The law of 1569 solidified the definition of this group, and those who wanted to be recognized as member of the cittadini originari needed to prove to the Avocaria di Comune that they, their fathers and grandfathers were born in Venice and were the issue of honorable and legitimate marriage. Prior to this, what it meant to be a member of the cittadini originari had been less rigid, and those who had simply been born in Venice might have been considered members of this group. This creates an interesting point of inquiry for examining the social professional status of lawyers in a wider frame, as unlike physicians or lay notaries who became socially prominent in the early modern period, the presence of non-patrician lawyers can be traced back to the 14th century. And practicing law had always been considered a socially prominent profession in the city, albeit not as established as the normal traditional profession for the middling tier of the city, the secretaries of the ducal chancery. The reason for this distinction was perhaps due to the evolution of the non-patrician legal profession itself, as it was originally conceived as one for patricians only, who were known as the avvocati ordinari, ordinary lawyers. And it was over the course of the 15th and the 16th centuries that this patrician profession evolved into a diverse group of patricians, citizens, and non-Venetian professionals. The Great Council initially viewed the legal profession as a public role, like the magistracy, to be filled by patricians who were elected and who performed their role out of a sense of duty to the Republic, not due to the high fees that they could earn from their clients. However, this created an imbalance in the courtroom itself, as the lawyers were not in the service of the lawyers were serving the Republic more than they were serving their clients, and in some cases that didn't go so well when the clients lost. As a consequence, from the 14th century onwards, non-patrician lawyers, known as avvocati straordinari, or extraordinary lawyers, were hired by the litigants to work alongside the patrician avvocati ordinari. The presence of avvocati straordinari was not viewed favourably by the Great Council. This was in one part due to the Great Council's desire to keep the profession reserved for patricians only, and on the other, a larger fear that by allowing them to practice in Venetian courts, Roman law would seep its way into the Venetian system. To clarify, the courts in Venice dealt almost exclusively in Venetian law, and even after Venice's conquest of the mainland, Roman law remained the law of the land in the Veneto and the broader mainland of Italy, and its use in Venice was strongly resisted. The avvocati ordinari and magistrates alike were required to have no training in Roman law in the Venetian courts. It wasn't until the 18th century that lawyers in Venice were required to possess a law degree from Padua. And yet, in spite of these fears, it was not possible to deny litigants the right to hire a non-patrician lawyer, especially in cases involving issues from the mainland, where knowledge of Roman law, even if it wasn't mentioned in the court itself, was necessary. Therefore, from the 14th century to the Correzione Gritti in 1537, there was a period in Venice when non-patrician lawyers were reluctantly permitted to practice in Venice with very few restrictions. In 1489, lawyers were required to register their practice with the Cancelleria del Senato, but there was no admission criteria or limit on numbers for those who registered. Then in 1497, a fixed tax was imposed upon them, Studies on the legal profession in this period have highlighted that those who were able to build a reputation for winning cases and work for affluent clients were able to charge high fees, and so in turn live a more lavish lifestyle, perhaps equivalent even to patricians, which then promoted their success and secured them more business. However, without a formal recognition of their profession, their professional status in the city was relatively tenuous, especially if they were relative newcomers who had no formal citizen status in the city. In 1537, a systematic reform of the profession was passed in the Correzione Gritti. The result for the legal profession was that the Great Council formally acknowledged the dual function of avvocati ordinari and avvocati straordinari, and from the admission criteria for the latter, it was solidified and based on their residence in the city or their citizenship status, not any particular legal expertise. After 1537, the avvocati straordinari, foreigners and citizens alike, were required to prove their birth or long residence in the city, as well as to register their practice in Venice with the avvocatori. This meant that those from outside the city, with ambition and skill, as well as the requisite years of residence, could build a high-earning career and establish themselves within a social, professional tier that over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries experienced an elevation in status. This was also facilitated by the court system itself, as only in the ordinary courts of San Marco and the Rialto did avvocati straordinari have to be members of the cittadini originari, or born in the city. In the lower courts, foreign lawyers could practice freely if they had lived in Venice for 10 years. So to conclude, it appears that prior to the reforms of the 16th century that solidified the definition of the cittadini originari and the legal profession, there was potential for ambitious members of the avvocati straordinari to charge high fees and to become wealthy, prominent individuals of the city. However, the Great Council's resistance to the presence of non-patrician lawyers and the absence of any formal recognition or regulation of their profession meant that in official terms, they would have been limited to their social position in the city. As is usual with papers of this nature, it raises more questions than it answers. Certainly from my perspective, this change in the law did not create a homogeneous group of legal professionals. There were no families of lawyers, for this instance, that I can find in my 17th century group from my PhD thesis. Some of the 17th century lawyers may have had fathers or brothers who were doctors of law or lawyers, but these were limited cases, and there's not a single case I can trace back from the lawyers in my PhD thesis to the Correzione Gritti. So although the legal profession may have been important and socially prestigious in the city, Correzione Gritti did not lead to an intergenerational practice of lawyers, and there's no obvious family signs of family nepotism that I can trace back to this point, and it remained a rather heterogeneous group of social professionals. I will end here. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome to your questions.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Really grateful and congratulations for the three really good and interesting papers. So, first one coming from Alessandro Rizzo, who has a question for Osden, but he says, thank you all the three. Have you by any chance found information on Florentines active in Constantinople who had relations with Florentines merchants who were active in the Mamluk Sultanate at the end of the 15th century?
Good question. Well, no, I mean, I cannot, I don't know. There must be, because, well, the printed materials, well, I'm referring to Benedetto D, and there are also some books related to the written on the activities of Florentine merchants in the Ottoman Empire, and they mainly focused on Adrianople, Bursa, and Constantinople, Edirne, Bursa, and Constantinople. But of course, Florentines had close contacts with the Mamluk sultans during this period. So I am sure that there were connections with the merchants. I mean, maybe merchants acting in Constantinople were also trading in the Mamluk Empire. That's quite possible, but I cannot give a specific example. Sorry.
Well, if not other questions, I would have a crossed question for Lisa and Carolina. If I don't mistaken, in Barcelona, the possession of a house was determinant to be a citizen. In Venice, Lisa did mention the residence, the payment of taxes, and the possibility of a Venetian wife. So the possession of a house was not considered as one of the determining facts to become a citizen.
I guess you mean if you are asking the question to Lisa, then if comparing to Barcelona.
Well, it's a comparison, so
well, in Barcelona, I would like to add, maybe because maybe I insisted a lot through neighborhood and presence, the physical presence in the city, about indeed this correspondence between the formal criteria and how this is expressed through these sources and through this witnessing. But again, you know, the criteria in Barcelona were very fluid, or that's what comes from these sources. So indeed, a house helped, but it was not determinant. So what was important is stable presence. And actually, among candidates, we find most of them who are renting their rooms in the city, and neighbors know it, and neighbors say it, and they clearly say that it's no problem renting or property. The property could be more satisfying in terms of the formal definition of it. So, I mean, there are candidates who may not be very integrated in the neighborhood. We can feel it from the witnessing, but the fact that they actually have acquired a property, then they are still granted the charter by the authorities, even if when you read the report, you're having your doubts, this person is fulfilling the citizenship criteria as much as others do. So yeah, again, there's always these two scales, no, of the more informal and formal. That's for Barcelona.
It's actually very interesting. I have a very similar answer. It's not that owning a house was necessary. In fact, even in the 17th century, most of the very affluent lawyers who paid massive rents, they owned property, but they didn't live in property. So my estimation would be that having your main residence in the city was important, and establishing yourself as being resident in Venice was important and necessary. But how owning a house wasn't, and it's even well established that patricians sometimes poorer patricians obviously, sometimes rented property in the city rather than lived in big Casa Grande. So it's an interesting division that owning property, at least then, wasn't necessary for citizenship.
But again, in comparative terms, I've read about other cities where indeed property was fundamental.
Yes.
I think Perpignan and I think Florence, but there I should, check again.
So then another question for us then. I don't know if it's a good or opportune question, but in the case of Barcelona, Carolina emphasized quite a lot the power of the city as a social space, and that she insisted that neighborhood was framed in a space. My question would be, to what extent the social space changed from Byzantine times to Ottoman Constantinople for Florentines or for foreign merchants being there?
Well, during the Florentines were not that active during the Byzantine times in Constantinople, but there were the Genoese and the Venetians. maybe the best example in this regard is the Genoese, because they were quite active and they established their colony in Pera. When the Ottomans came, what changed? In the case of Pera, of course, there were significant changes. Some of the churches became mosques, but all these took time. I mean, when we talk about Mehmet II's time, just after the conquest, still Pera preserved its European European in the sense that there were a lot of settlers from Italian cities and other places. So in terms of church, in terms of entertainment places, this place was like, for also Ottomans, this place was Frangistan, which is like place of Franks, referring to that. And so we can understand, I mean, even in the Ottoman chronicles, it is written like that. So we can understand that still Pera or Galata was preserving its European Christian identity just after the conquest. But when we come to 16th century, through migrations and settlement of different groups of people, Pera also started to change, but more or less it preserved this reputation quite a long time.
Thank you. Antonella, perhaps open her
Thank
camera.
you. Thank you to all our three speakers, and thank you, Roser, for chairing this session amazingly as always. And thank you to everyone who has attended today. So take care, everyone. Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.